letter had been sealed with black wax, and it smelled of smoke. Not the clean smoke of a hearth fire, but something older, something deliberate, as though the paper itself had been pulled from the edge of a flame at the very last moment. Rosalind Ashworth found it tucked between 2 pages of a surveyor's report, dated 1802, buried in a chest that had not been opened in what appeared to be a generation. The seal bore no crest. The hand inside was cramped and urgent, and it began with words that made her breath stop. "Forgive me. By the time you read this, I will have taken what was never mine to take." She set the letter down on the long oak table, her fingers trembling despite herself, and looked around the empty room. The archive at Thornfield Hall was less a room than a crypt for paper. It occupied the entire north wing of the ground floor. A vast, cold chamber with vaulted ceilings and windows so high and narrow they admitted only thin blades of grey afternoon light. A dust lay on every surface like a second skin. The shelves, built floor to ceiling in dark mahogany, sagged under the weight of ledgers, boxes, rolled maps, and leather portfolios tied with rotting ribbon. Nobody had catalogued any of it. Nobody had touched it in years, perhaps decades. That was why she was here. Rosalind Ashworth was 27 years old, the daughter of Sir Philip Ashworth, a baronet, whose title was older than some of the trees on this estate, but whose fortune had evaporated long before her birth. Her father had been a scholar, a gentleman who read Greek for pleasure and Latin for comfort, and who had died owning precisely 12 acres of waterlogged Dorset farmland, a house with a leaking roof, and the most magnificent private collection of medieval manuscripts in the south of England, which he had promptly bequeathed to the Bodleian Library because, he said, beautiful things should be where people can see them. It left Rosalind with an education that rivaled any man's, a spine made of quiet iron, and not a penny to her name. She had made her way since then as women of her particular class and misfortune did, occupying the narrow corridor between gentility and poverty, too well-born to work as a servant, too poor to live as a lady. She had catalogued libraries for 3 estates before Thornfield, each time arriving with her single trunk, and her careful, steady hands, and each time departing without having left a mark on the household beyond a set of meticulously ordered shelves. She was, by design and by necessity, invisible, a woman who passed through grand houses the way light passes through glass, useful but unremarked. Thornfield Hall was the seat of the Marquess of Ravensworth, one of the oldest titles in the north of England. The estate sprawled across thousands of acres of Yorkshire moorland, its boundaries marked by ancient stone walls that ran along the ridges like the spine of some sleeping creature. The house itself was enormous, a Jacobean pile of honey-coloured stone with mullioned windows and chimneys that rose, like a forest of stone fingers, against the perpetually overcast sky. It would have been magnificent. It was, instead, slowly dying. The signs were everywhere for anyone who cared to look. The east wing was shuttered entirely, its rooms draped in white sheets, their doors dark and damp. The gardens, once famous for their rose walks and ornamental lake, had gone feral, the hedges growing wild, the lake choked with reeds. The stables held 3 horses, where once there had been 30. The household staff had been reduced to a skeleton, the remaining servants moving through the vast empty rooms with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their positions hung by a thread. The current Marquess, Lord Thomas Hale, had inherited the estate 3 years prior upon the sudden death of his father, the sixth Marquess. He was 31, tall and lean, with dark auburn hair that he wore longer than fashion dictated, and a face that might have been handsome if it were not so habitually closed. He had the look of a man besieged, his jaw set, his grey-green eyes always focused on some middle distance, as though calculating costs even in his sleep. He had hired Rosalind through his solicitor in London with instructions so terse they bordered on rude. The archives are in disarray. I want a complete catalogue. Sir, you will have 6 months. That was the sum total of their correspondence. She had met him once, on her first morning. He had appeared in the doorway of the archive room, looked at her for 3 seconds, as though committing her face to memory for the sole purpose of then forgetting it, and said, "Mrs. Finch will see to your needs. Meals are at 7 and 1. Do not disturb the household." Then he had gone. Facton. She had not spoken to him since, though she saw him from the archive windows sometimes, a solitary figure striding across the moor toward the tenant farms, his greatcoat flapping in the wind, man, always in motion, always alone. She did not mind the solitude. She had grown accustomed to it, and the work, at least, was absorbing. The Thornfield archives were extraordinary in their chaos. Centuries of accumulated paper jammed together without system or sense. She had found Tudor-era land grants stuffed alongside Georgian invoices for wallpaper. There were boxes of personal letters, bundles of tenant agreements, to stacks of household accounts going back 200 years. It was, for someone of her training, both a disaster and a treasure. She worked methodically, beginning with the oldest materials and moving forward through time, creating a master index on long sheets of foolscap that she pinned to a board above her desk. It was in her 3rd week, deep in the records of the late Marquess's tenure, that she found the letter in the surveyor's report, and it was the letter that pulled the first thread. She read it again slowly. It was addressed to no one. It was written by a man named Hartley, who identified himself as the estate's land agent from 1795 to 1807. He described, in increasingly frantic detail, a scheme by which he and the late Marquess had manipulated the tenant leases. The method was elegant in its cruelty. The official leases, the documents signed by the tenants and filed with the solicitors, recorded one set of rents a stay. But the actual rents collected were higher, sometimes by as much as 40%. The difference was skimmed off before the money ever reached the estate's official accounts, funneled through a network of private notes, and then into the late Marquess's personal funds. Hartley's letter was a confession. He had been the instrument, but the architect, he wrote, was his lordship himself. "I was weak," the letter said. "He was my employer and my patron. I told myself it was not theft if the master commanded it. But it was theft, and the people who paid the price were those who could least afford it." The letter ended abruptly. There was no signature, only a date, March 1807. Rosalind sat very still in the cold archive room and listened to the wind keening against the windows. Then, she set the letter aside and began to search. It took her 2 weeks. She worked through the nights, the archive lit by a paraffin lamp that threw long, shaking shadows across the shelves. She cross-referenced tenant leases with household accounts, with the land agent's private journals, which she found in a locked drawer of the desk she used daily. She matched dates and names and figures with the meticulous care her father had taught her, the care of a person who understood that truth lived in details. The picture that emerged was devastating. For 12 years, the 6th Marquess of Ravensworth had systematically stolen from his tenants. The sums taken from each individual family were not enormous. A few pounds here, an extra tithe there, small enough to be explained away as administrative fees or market adjustments. But multiplied across dozens of farms, and over a decade, the total was staggering. Rosalind calculated it 3 times to be certain. The figure came to nearly £4,000. In an era when a farm labourer earned perhaps £30 a year, it was a fortune, and it had vanished entirely, swallowed by the late Marquess's catastrophic investments in a colonial trading venture that had collapsed in 1810, taking every penny with it. Here in these dusty papers was the answer to the mystery that had haunted Thornfield for a generation. Yes, the estate was not declining because of bad luck or poor harvests, or the general difficulties of the age. It was declining because its wealth had been stolen from the people who generated it and then lost to the sea. The rot was not financial, it was moral. Yet Rosalind assembled her evidence with the same precision she brought to her cataloguing. She created a summary document, clear and chronological, listing every discrepancy, every cross-reference, every damning annotation. When it was finished, she sat for a long time in the archive room, the slim folder on the table before her, and thought about what she was about to do. She was about to tell a man that his father was a thief, a man who was already drowning, a man who had hired her to sort papers, not to excavate sins. She thought about saying nothing to say. She thought about simply completing her catalogue, packing her trunk, and leaving Thornfield with her wages and her silence. It would be the prudent thing to do. It would be the safe thing. She could not. She thought of the tenant families whose names filled her summary: Barton, Innes, Cresswell, Houghton. She had seen their descendants in the village, their faces weathered, their clothes patched, their children thin. They were the inheritors of a theft they did not even know had occurred. To keep silent was to become complicit in it. She requested an audience with the Marquess, through Mrs. Drummond, the housekeeper, formidable woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Drummond regarded her for a long moment, then said, "He is very occupied, Miss Ashworth. The quarterly rents are due. The numbers are not kind." "It concerns the archives," Rosalind said. "It is a matter of some importance." Mrs. Drummond nodded slowly. "I will ask." The summons came the following evening, just after 7. The Marquess would see her in the study. The study at Thornfield was a room designed to intimidate. It was panelled in dark oak, the walls hung with portraits of previous Marquesses, men with hard eyes and harder mouths. A fire burned in the grate, but did nothing to warm the vast space. Lord Hale stood behind his desk, not sitting, as though he could not afford to stop moving, even in the privacy of his own room. And in his shirt sleeves, his cravat loosened, his desk covered in papers and ledgers, he looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes were deep, and his jaw was clenched with the particular tension of a man who has been staring at bad numbers for hours. He did not look up when she entered. "Mrs. Drummond says your business is urgent." "It is, my lord." "Then be brief." "I have a meeting with the bank in York on Thursday, and I am attempting to find a way to present our finances that does not look like a catastrophe." The irony of that statement was so sharp that Rosalind felt it like a physical thing, a blade turning in her chest. He was preparing to beg a bank for money to save an estate that had been ruined by stolen money. He did not know. He was fighting a war without knowing where the wound was. If what I have to tell you concerns the estate's finances, my lord, it concerns your father. He looked up then, and his grey-green eyes were flat, guarded. My father. I have discovered evidence in the archives, she said, keeping her voice level, of a systematic fraud perpetrated against the tenants of this estate by the late Marquess, acting in concert with a land agent named Hartley over a period of 12 years. The silence that followed was absolute. The fire cracked. A clock ticked somewhere in the room. Lord Hale's face, which had been merely tired, went completely still. It was the stillness of stone, of something that has been struck but has not yet begun to fall. Say that again. She said it again. She laid out the evidence clearly, calmly, as her father had taught her fact by fact. The dual rent system, the private journals, Hartley's letter, the missing £4,000, the colonial venture. She placed her folder on his desk, beside his bank papers, and stepped back. He did not touch the folder. His eyes were fixed on her face, and something in them had shifted. They were no longer tired. They were dangerous. You are a cataloguer, Miss Ashworth. You were engaged to sort and list the contents of the archive. Nothing more. I am an archivist, my lord. My duty is to the integrity of the record. Your duty, he said, and his voice was very quiet, very controlled, is to do as you are instructed. I did not instruct you to rummage through private family papers. I did not instruct you to play detective. I did not instruct you to make accusations against a man who cannot defend himself. The evidence defends itself, my lord. It is in your own archives, in your father's own hand. He came around the desk then, and she saw the full force of his anger. It was not the hot, explosive rage of a volatile man. It was cold, impressed, the fury of someone who has been holding himself together for years, and who has just been told that the foundation beneath him is rotten. Do you have any conception, he said, and standing close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, of what you are saying? You are telling me that my father who built this estate, who was loved by every person in this county, was a common thief. He was not common about it, Rosalind said quietly. He was very methodical. Something flashed in his eyes, shock perhaps, or the ghost of a recognition he was not ready to admit. He turned away from her, pacing to the fireplace, placing his hands on the mantel. This is a fabrication, a misreading. You have taken a few ambiguous entries and constructed a conspiracy from them. I have the letter, my lord, written in the hand of the man who helped him do it. It is a confession by a disgraced land agent, he snapped, turning back. A man who was dismissed for incompetence, and you take his word over the honor of this family. I take the numbers, my lord. The numbers do not lie. He stared at her for a long, terrible moment. Then, he said, in a voice so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the room, I think I understand now. You have been here 5 weeks. You have seen the state of this estate, the difficulties we face, and you have seen an opportunity. A woman in your position, with information like this, information that could ruin a family's name. What is it you want, Miss Ashworth? A permanent position? Protection? The accusation landed like a blow to the chest. Personal. For a moment she could not breathe. He thought she was blackmailing him. He looked at her and saw not a woman of integrity, but a schemer, a fortune hunter, a parasite. The injustice of it was so vast, so complete, that it burned through her composure like acid through silk. I want nothing from you, my lord, she said. Her voice did not waver. Take me. I came to you because the tenants of this estate have been wronged, and you are the only person with the power to make it right. Is all. Then you are a fool as well as a meddler. He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily, dismissing her with his posture. Your employment is terminated, Miss Ashworth. I want you gone by morning. I will have Mrs. Drummond arrange the carrier. Rosalind stood very still. She looked at the folder on his desk, the weeks of careful, painstaking work it represented, truth it contained. She looked at the man behind the desk, his face closed, his eyes averted. Look at her. He could not. Do you know what your father's tenants call this land? She said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. They call it hungry ground. They have called it that for 30 years. The soil is not poor, my lord. The land is good. But the people on it were made poor, deliberately, systematically, by the man whose portrait hangs above your fireplace. He flinched. It was small, barely perceptible, a tightening of the muscles around his eyes. But she saw it. Listen, I can find 100 women to do what you do, he said, and his voice was rough, as though the words cost him something. 100 women with neat handwriting and sharp eyes and the presumption to lecture their betters. You are replaceable, Miss Ashworth. Do not mistake yourself for something you are not. Icton. The words hung between them. 100 women. Replaceable. In his eyes, in that moment, she was not a person with a name and a history, and a father who had taught her that truth was sacred. She was a function, a servant who had forgotten her place. Something settled inside Rosalind Ashworth then, a calm so deep it felt like the stillness at the bottom of the sea. She had done what she came to do. She had carried the truth into this room and set it down. What he did with it was no longer her burden. Then find them, she said. She did not raise her voice, did not weep. She did not argue, simply turned, walked to the door, opened it, stepped through, and closed it behind her with a soft, definitive click. Thomas Hale sat motionless behind his desk, staring at the closed door. The click of the latch rang in the silence like a struck bell. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading, protest, yet the collapse of composure that he associated with women confronted by male authority. He had been prepared for that. He had not been prepared for this. The quiet devastation of a woman who simply agreed and left, then find them. Not a challenge, not an insult. A statement of fact, delivered with the calm of someone who understood her own, worth precisely, who did not need his validation and would not beg for it. Indeed, he sat in the silence of his study and felt the anger drain out of him in slow, sickening waves, leaving behind something colder and more frightening. Doubt. His eyes fell on the folder. He reached for it with the intention of tearing it apart, of feeding it to the fire page by page. Instead, his hand rested on the cover, and he found he could not move. Her voice was in his head, precise and unshakable. Numbers do not lie. He opened the folder. He read for 4 hours. At some point the fire died and the room grew cold, but he did not notice. He pulled the ledgers she had referenced from the archive shelves, carried them to his desk in armfuls, and checked every figure, every cross-reference, every date. He found the land agent's journals. He found Hartley's letter. The ink faded, but the words horribly clear. Essay. He found his father's annotations in the margins of the tenant leases, the same bold, confident hand that had signed Thomas's school reports and written him letters at university, letters full of advice about honor and duty and the responsibilities of their name. It was all true, every word of it. The man in the portrait above the fireplace, Icama, The man Thomas had loved with the uncritical devotion of a son who had never been given reason to doubt was a fraud. The estate's decline, which Thomas had attributed to misfortune, to the vagaries of agricultural markets, to his own inadequacy as a steward, was the direct and calculable consequence of his father's systematic theft from the people who depended on him. Thomas put his head in his hands. He sat like that for a long time. When he finally looked up, the first grey light of dawn was seeping through the study windows. He looked at the clock. It was 20 minutes past 5. The surveyor coach came through the village at 6:30. She would be on it. She would be gone, and with her would go the only honest thing that had happened in this house in 30 years. He stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. He did not stop for a coat, did not call for a servant, did not look in the mirror. He walked through the sleeping house, past his father's portrait in the great hall, a painting he could no longer bear to see, and out the front door into the raw Yorkshire dawn. The air was sharp with cold, a low mist lay across the fields, and the sky was the colour of pewter. He could see his breath. He began to walk, then to run, his shoes slipping on the wet gravel of the drive, his shirt soaking through with mist. The village was 1.5 miles down the valley road. He ran it without stopping. If you are enjoying this story, please tap the subscribe button so you won't miss new stories. And now, let us see what happened next. Rosalind had packed before dawn. Trunk held what it always held. 3 dresses, her father's Virgil, her portfolio of pencil sketches, her cataloguing tools. She carried it down the stairs herself. Mrs. Drummond was waiting in the hall with a cloth bundle, warm bread and ham, and a small jar of preserves. "A road," the housekeeper said. Her face was composed, but her eyes held something Rosalind had not seen before. Respect. "You did right, miss," Mrs. Drummond said quietly. "See, some truths are too big to carry alone, and some men are not ready to hear them." Rosalind took the bundle and held the older woman's hand for a moment. Then she walked out into the mist. The walk to the village took 20 minutes. The air smelled of wet grass and peat smoke, and somewhere a curlew was calling across the moor, its cry thin and desolate. Rosalind walked with her back straight and her eyes forward. At her, she felt a clean, sharp grief, not for the loss of her position, which she had half expected, but for the tenants of Thornfield, the families whose stolen inheritance lay documented on the Marquess's desk, waiting to be burned or believed. She had done what she could. The rest was not in her hands. She reached the crossroads where the carrier stopped. 2 other passengers were already waiting, a farmer's wife with a basket of eggs, and an elderly clergyman reading a pocket Bible. Rosalind set her trunk down and stood in the pale morning light and waited. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of running footsteps, uneven on the rough road, accompanied by heavy breathing. She turned and saw a figure coming down the hill from the direction of the hall. He was in his shirt sleeves, his hair dark with mist, his face flushed with exertion. He was the Marquess of Ravensworth, and he was running through a public road at dawn, like a man pursued. But he stopped a few paces from her, breathing hard. The other passengers stared. The clergyman lowered his Bible. The farmer's wife clutched her eggs. Thomas Hale looked at Rosalind, and she saw his face, and she understood. She saw the remnants of a night spent in the company of his father's sins. She saw the devastation, the shame, the collapse of everything he had believed about his own history, and she saw, beneath all of it, something new, something that looked like the beginning of clarity. You were right, he said. His voice was hoarse. About everything. The carrier was rattling down the road toward them, the driver already calling out for passengers. I read it all, he said. Every page, every number. It is exactly as you described. He paused, and she watched him struggle with the next words, watched the pride and the pain fight for control of his expression. I was wrong to say what I said to you. It was unforgivable. It was unkind, Rosalind said, but I do not think it was unforgivable. The carrier pulled to a stop. The farmer's wife and the clergyman climbed aboard. The driver looked at Rosalind. Coming, miss? Thomas took a step closer. Do not go, he said. It was not a command. No, there was no aristocratic authority in it. It was the voice of a man standing in the ruins of his certainty, asking for help. Stay. Help me make it right. I cannot do this alone. Do not know how to begin. Rosalind looked at the carrier, the road south, the life of quiet wandering that waited for her. Another library, another great house, another set of shelves to order, while the world went on around her unseen. Then she looked at the man before her. She saw the weight of what he carried, and she saw the willingness to carry it honestly, and she knew that her work at Thornfield was not finished. It had only just begun. No, she said to the driver, I am not. She picked up her trunk. Thomas moved to take it from her, but she shook her head. She would carry her own weight. They walked back up the hill together, in silence, the mist beginning to lift, the first pale sunlight breaking through the clouds and falling in long shafts across the moor. What followed were the hardest months of Thomas Hale's life, and the most necessary. They worked together in the archive room, the cold north chamber that had been Rosalind's solitary domain, and which now became the center of a slow, painful reckoning. The long oak table disappeared under maps, leases, ledgers, and columns of calculations. Thomas cancelled his meeting with the bank in York. Borrowing money to repair damage caused by stolen money was lie built on a lie, he said. They would repay the debt from what they had. What they had was not much. To make restitution, to repay even a portion of what had been taken from the tenants over 12 years, would require selling nearly everything that was not entailed with the estate. The London townhouse, the art collection, a set of Flemish tapestries that had been in the family for 2 centuries, his mother's pearls. Thomas did not hesitate. Ishton. He wrote to his solicitor with a steady hand and instructions that left no room for argument. Sell everything. The man wrote back expressing alarm, then concern, then reluctant compliance. Then came the hardest part. They told the tenants. Thomas insisted on doing it himself, face to face, farm by farm. He asked Rosalind to accompany him. I need a witness, he said, someone they trust, someone who is not a Hale. They went together across the moor and through the valleys, to every cottage and farmhouse on the estate. At each door, Thomas stood before men and women whose families had worked this land for generations, and he told them the truth. He did not soften it. He did not make excuses. My father stole from your family, he said to old Mr. Barton, a man of 70 whose father had been one of the first victims. For 12 years he took money that was rightfully yours. I am here to acknowledge that wrong and to begin making restitution. The reactions were as varied as the families themselves. There was anger, deep and old. There was disbelief. Mrs. Innes, whose husband had died the previous winter, leaving her with 4 children and a farm she could barely manage, sat down heavily in her kitchen chair and said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, I always knew something wasn't right. My father-in-law used to say the numbers never added up, but who would believe a tenant over a marquess? One man, George Cresswell, would say, whose grandfather had lost his farm entirely, and whose family had been reduced to day labourers, looked at Thomas for a long moment, and then turned his back and walked into his cottage and closed the door. He did not want an apology. The wound was too old, but most of them listened, and most of them looked at Rosalind, standing quietly beside the Marquess, her presence a silent testament that this was not performance but penance, and they saw something they had never seen from the hall before: honesty. New leases were drawn up, fair ones, with rents calculated by an independent agent. This day, a portion of the restitution was paid immediately from the first sales. The rest was promised, formally in writing, with Rosalind's meticulous records as the foundation. Through all of this, something shifted between them, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way the season shifts from winter to spring in the north, not all at once, but in small, accumulating moments of warmth. The formal distance dissolved first. He stopped calling her Miss Ashworth on a Tuesday afternoon in the archive room when she pointed out an error in his arithmetic, and he laughed, a real laugh, the first she had heard from him, and said, "You are right, Rosalind, as you are infuriatingly always right." She looked up, startled by the sound of her name in his mouth, and saw that his eyes, which had been the colour of stone for as long as she had known him, were warm. She began calling him Thomas a week later, when he came in from the rain soaked to the skin, and she handed him a towel and said, without thinking, "You will catch your death, Thomas," and then stopped, flushed. He looked at her, and a smile touched the corner of his mouth, small and private and entirely unguarded. They ate their meals together now, in a canteen, not in the great dining room, but in the small sitting room off the kitchen, where a fire could actually warm the space. They talked about the estate, about the tenants, about the future, but they also talked about other things: books, music, her father's love of Virgil, his mother, had died when he was 12, and who had planted the rose garden that was now being slowly, painstakingly restored. He told her about his years at Oxford, how he had wanted to study natural philosophy, but had been pulled back to the estate by duty. She told him about the years after her father's death, the quiet, grinding loneliness of a woman with no money and too much education, moving from house to house, always useful, never belonging, to say. "You belong here," he said one evening, and then looked away, as though the words had escaped without his permission. The restitution was completed in early spring. The last of the London assets had been sold. The tenants had their new leases. Thornfield was leaner than it had ever been, stripped of its ornaments, its pretensions, its comfortable lies. But it was solvent. It was honest. And for the first time in a generation, the tenants looked at the hall without resentment. On the evening the last papers were signed, Thomas and Rosalind sat in the archive room, the table cleared for the first time in months. The windows were open, and the spring air came in, carrying the smell of wet earth and new grass and something blooming, the first of the wild daffodils on the moor. "It is done," Thomas said. "It is begun," Rosalind said. He looked at her. She was illuminated by the evening light, her face calm, her hands folded on the table. Her work was finished. She could leave now. She was free. A thought struck him with a force that took his breath. The idea of this house without her in it. The silence, old. "What will you do now?" he asked, and his voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man asking a question whose answer terrifies him. I suppose I shall find another position, she said. Another library. I can find 100 women to do what you do. The memory of his own words turned in his chest like a knife. He could hire 100 archivists, but there was only one Rosalind Ashworth. I have another position in mind, he said, if you would consider it. She waited, her expression giving nothing away. He stood and came around the table. He did not kneel. It's not that kind of moment. He simply stood before her, his hands at his sides, his vulnerability open and undefended. This estate needs more than a marquess. It needs a conscience. It needs a heart. He paused. I need you, Rosalind, not as an archivist, not as an employee, as my wife, as my partner, still in this and in everything. Rosalind looked up at him. She thought of the man who had stood in his study and called her replaceable, to me. She thought of the man who had run through the mist at dawn because he could not bear to let the truth walk away. She thought of all the months between those two moments, the slow, difficult work of demolishing a lie and building something honest in its place. The love she felt for him was not the love of novels, not the swooning, breathless kind. It was something quieter and stronger, forged in shared labor and mutual respect, and the stubborn, unglamorous pursuit of what was right. She reached out and placed her hand over his. He covered it with his other hand, and his grip was warm and firm and steady. 1 year later, the archive room at Thornfield Hall was no longer a crypt. The windows had been cleaned, and the spring light poured in, falling across shelves of books that were now perfectly ordered, each one catalogued in Rosalind's clear hand. The long oak table still stood at the center of the room, but it was used now for estate meetings, for planning the planting of new orchards, for sketching designs for the restored cottages. Now the Marquess of Ravensworth stood by the window, looking out at the gardens. The wild hedge had been cut back. The ornamental lake was clear, and in the rose garden which Thomas's mother had planted 40 years ago, and which had gone to ruin in the years of neglect, new bushes were blooming, petals white and pink against the dark Yorkshire stone. She heard his step behind her and turned. Thomas came in from the fields, his boots muddy, his face weathered by wind, his expression lighter than she had ever seen it. He had lost the hunted look. He looked like a man who belonged to his land. Mean. He crossed the room and put his arms around her, pulling her close. Young Barton came to see me this morning, he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. He and the Cresswell girl are getting married. He asked if they could hold the celebration on the south lawn. Rosalind smiled. A year ago, no tenant would have dared ask such a thing. A year ago, the Marquess would never have considered it. And what did you say? I said we would be honored. They stood together in the quiet of the archive room, the spring air drifting through the open windows, seeing the scent of roses and new-mown grass. The house was breathing again. Do you ever regret it? Thomas asked. This life, it is not the life a marchioness is supposed to have. It is no London season, no grand balls, no jewels. Rosalind turned in his arms and looked up at him. She thought of the life she might have had, the endless quiet progression from library to library, always useful, always invisible, always alone. I have never been happier, she said, and it was the plain, unvarnished truth. He kissed her, and it was the kiss of two people who had earned their peace. I, who had walked through the fire of a shared reckoning, and come out the other side holding hands. That evening he found her in the archive room again, a fresh ledger open on the table before her. He felt a momentary tightness in his chest, a reflex of the old shame. But when he looked over her shoulder, he saw that she was not writing in the pages of rents and figures. It turned to the back of the book, to the clean, empty pages, and in her clear, steady hand she had written, "Thornfield Estate, 1818. A new record. Below it, April, lawn. The south lawn offered for the wedding of Samuel Barton and Anne Cresswell, and beneath that, the first roses bloomed in Lady Hale's garden, white and pink after 40 years of silence. She was writing a new history for Thornfield, not a record of debts and losses, but a chronicle of small graces, of mended fences and open doors, of a house learning to be honest, one season at a time. Thomas placed his hand over hers on the open page, his fingers lacing through hers. The past was a scar they would always carry, a reminder of the cost of silence and the price of truth. But the future was a clean page, and they would fill it together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are listening from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss new stories.